Hello everyone. This video is going to be a little bit of an update, a little bit of a ramble, and a little bit of a display of some figures that I've painted recently. So what am I up to? Well, I've started attending another War Games club in Plymouth now. It meets every fortnight. So far I've been to, I think, 4 meetings, and wasn't able to get to the one that was due this week. So being fortnightly, it's a little bit more intermittent, but it's great to be out playing socially again. And inevitably it has influence what I'm painting, what I'm playing, because not playing so much solo wargaming, you're kind of more, what you play is determined by the sort of consensus, really. And one thing I'm very pleased to have got back into is bolt action, which is a perfect club game. Something that I used to play. So I've got the old edition here, and last month I invested in the second edition. I think not much difference really in the rules. So far all the changes that I can see have improved the game. So I haven't got any problems with that, but I'm doubtful really that there was a need to do a second edition. But anyway, it's done, and I've had 2 games of bolt action at the club. The first one I used my friend's figures. I played Japanese against his well, they were mainly kind of Australian, but there was some Gurkhas thrown into it as well. Really good game. And then the week after, no, not the week after, the fortnight after that, I took in my Congo figures and we had a game of Congo. Well, I sort of put it on and umpired it and taught 2 other players the rules of it, really, and that was great fun as well. 2 weeks after that I took my paras in and used those in a game of bolt action, got absolutely creamed. It's just something about the paras, I was never able to win with them. So it's probably me, it's probably that I'm not a very good player. I did have some bad luck with the drawing of the dice and the timing of when the particular dice came out and so on, which is a feature of bolt action. That's going to be the theme really of my rambly bit of this video. It's going to be a discussion about realism in war games and historical accuracy, and beyond that, realism. Anyway, after that, not sure if we missed. Oh yeah, I missed the week just before Christmas. Couldn't get to it, and then just after Christmas, we played a game of what was it called? Lacquered Coffins, which is absolutely brilliant. World War II aerial combat game. I'm seriously thinking of getting into it, acquiring the rules and getting into it. It's 1/3000th scale, so conveniently it fits into the same scale as Cruel Seas, which is hopefully the next game that we'll get to play. I'm going to take my models in and play that. But yeah, Lacquered Coffins, check it out. I'm not sure. Can't remember the name now of the the story. I think the author is Australian, I believe. He sent a copy of the rules to my friend to review for his blog, and really impressed by it. I won't go into the details of the rules, but they work really well. But they're published and sold, I think, from an American website called Iron something. I should have checked that out before I started this video, but anyway. So yeah, the clubs are going really well, and my powers aren't going quite so well. So what I decided to do, having enjoyed the game that I played using my friend's Japanese forces, was to complete the painting of my Japanese army, because I have got a small force, not quite enough to play a game with yet. Mainly assault group figures. I've shown them on the channel before, and as you'll know, I've got a massive pile of unpainted figures surrounding me, and all I had to do was kind of go to that really, and dig out some tanks and some unpainted figures and paint those up. I'm going to show those to you shortly. One thing about this video is I'm going to want to kind of keep going backwards and forwards between this table surface and books that I want to kind of like page through in front of the camera and talk about, and the figures themselves. So it's going to be a little bit, I'm going to have to edit this quite carefully because I don't want to kind of have to keep zooming the camera in and out and so on. So I'm going to film it. I'm going to film the figures and models separately, but keep jumping almost mid-sentence between that and this table surface. So I already had a lot of supplements for bolt action. I had all these ones. Japan, Great Britain, the armies of Germany, Soviet Union, and the United States. And one thing that I'm really pleased about, and applaud Warlord for doing it, or rather not doing it, is that all these supplements are completely compatible with the new second edition. Something that really annoyed me when Field of Glory Fog brought out a third edition was that all the supplements for the first and second edition ceased to be usable. The army lists changed, all kind of things like that. So the investment that people had made, and I'd made a considerable investment in purchasing all their supplements for their different theatres and periods and so on, was wasted, and the books were only of use for the illustrations, for references for how to paint figures and so on. But these are compatible with the new ones. I did buy this supplement, which is Market Garden, which, as you can see, came out after the second edition. One thing I have picked up on is that there is a kind of tendency, one YouTube channel described it as a power creep, and I think that is very obvious, that it is possible to, as the new supplements come out, to selectively design armies that are game winners, really. Some of the lists in here, I'm not saying this for certain, but some of the lists in here might easily win over some of the armies, I don't know, in the original Armies of Germany book, for instance. So it's an issue at tournaments and so on, and something that something you have to be aware of. I personally, I'm going off the idea of tournaments. I did used to take place in saga tournaments, but I I'm changing my attitude to them now. I'm ceasing to think that they are a fun way of enjoying the hobby, really. If you go to them, it stops you taking part in the convention. You basically got to play games the whole time you're at a show or a convention, and you don't get much time to enjoy the show itself. But there's also, no matter how friendly the nature of the event, there is still this underlying issue of rule changes and new additions coming out and so on, and it can lead to a little bit of friction and some kind of bad feeling. And as far as I can tell from video reports on the recent World tournament that took place, that Warlord held, there were some problems at that event with the organisation and the composition of the army lists and so on. Anyway, that really sort of takes me into the subject of realism. That bolt action is not a realistic game, and it's not. I don't think its value lies in the fact that it's not. I don't think the realism matters, is what I'm trying to say. It's a really good game, perfect for clubs, very easy to get into in terms of the number of figures you've got to paint and so on. But because it's an historical game, if you can call it that, I think there's a danger of people playing it and assuming that they're increasing their knowledge of the history of the Second World War. And I'm going to get into that in a lot more depth a little bit later. But let me just cut now to the figures that I painted up, and you might begin to see what I'm trying to tell you, what I'm trying to say. Yeah, sorry, before I do that, and I will show you some figures in a minute, I promise. Another thing that has really kind of delighted me is that I noticed that Warlord are about to bring out another supplement to the second edition, covering the Korean War, so covering a later period. And I already have armies that I can play that period with. I've got loads of 20mm figures already. I've got painted a Chinese army and an American army, but unpainted I've got British and I've got North Koreans. So I'm definitely, the supplement's coming out around August, September time, 2019. And I'm definitely, that has kind of, as I say, it does influence my painting plans and so on. There's no way that I can not now get those out of my lead mountain and start applying paint to those. So it's going to kind of like divert me a little bit from some of my never-ending list of things to do and things to paint and war games to get into. So it's just another one to add to the list. But I'm certainly going to be paying a lot of attention to that in upcoming months. So you'll see that appearing on my channel as well. But anyway, on to the figures. Okay, so first up, I've got the classic Chiha tank, which I haven't painted it up with any markings on it for a number of reasons. Mainly that looking at images and so on, I think you can get away without having markings on Japanese tanks. They weren't very prominent, if they were there at all. And looking at some of the illustrations in books and so on, you get some of the hiragana lettering on the sides of the tank, so on, and tiny little symbols and so on. But I wasn't too sure if I put those on whether it would tie me into a specific theatre or something like that. So I decided to not to paint them on, and also not to paint on the kind of yellow streaks that you do get. I think they're yellow or white that you do see occasionally, just to give it a kind of very basic paint job. But I'm quite pleased with how it's turned out, and wanted to ask any players out there who could give me some instruction. That the turret has got a light howitzer as its main weapon, but it's got this rear-facing machine gun. Now, in the second edition, there is a tankette which has a forward and a rear-facing weapon in the turret, but the turret is a single-manned turret, which means the chap in there is kind of operating both the guns as well as kind of guiding the tank. So it's a little bit restricted, but that's not the case for this tank, this larger tank. And what is puzzling me is that for normally, if a tank has a machine gun in the turret, it's a coaxial gun, and there's a rule in bolt action that one or other can be fired in the same turn, but not both. But what happens? What is the case with a rear-facing weapon? Are you restricted to only firing one or other in a turn with a Japanese tank with this kind of setup, or can you fire both? And if that is the case, are you constrained to only firing in the opposite direction for the machine gun if you already fired the howitzer, the light howitzer, in the other direction? Or can you assume that the turret has then swiveled round to fire at the same target? As far as I can see in the rules, they describe the machine gun as rear-facing, which implies that throughout the game you're only allowed to fire into the rear arc of the tank, which doesn't make sense to me either, because the turret has got a 360-degree arc of fire. So how do people play their Japanese tanks, is my question. My opinion is that you could be allowed to play both in one turn, but you couldn't assume that the turret could swivel around and fire both at the same target. That if you do fire your light howitzer first, and then you want to fire the machine gun, you should be limited to anything that is in the other 180-degree arc of the turret. But anyone who has a definitive notion on that, rather than your opinion, if anyone knows what the rule is exactly, then I'd be very grateful to hear. Yeah, so I think that was all I wanted to say on that particular tank. So I've also painted up this one, which is Shin Ho To, I believe it's called. So this has got a slightly more powerful weapon on it. So it's a high velocity anti-tank gun. So a little bit more use against enemy armour. similar kind of chassis and hull and everything though. And when I purchased these, they were separate. I've had them a long time, and they were separate models that you ordered separately. But as far as I can see now, you buy one model that has two variants of the turret, so you can have one or the other. I mean, presumably, if you didn't fix the turret into place, they would be interchangeable, so you would have two tanks in one, really. But when I purchased this, the hulls, although they look similar, are actually different in the models, and the recess that you place the turret into was a different dimension, so that they weren't compatible. You couldn't take the turret off one and put it on the other. So that has changed. And same question really about the rear. This has also got the rear-facing turret machine gun. What do you do about that? But other than that, I think that's all I have to say on that one. And then this is a little bit irritating. But I thought I'd show you this as well, because in my lead mounting, and this is a disadvantage of purchasing things and just putting them away and not looking at them and getting them out 5 years later, and then finding that they're not complete, or they're not ideal in one particular way or the other. So I can't remember what I thought I was buying when I purchased this. Excuse me. It's I think I intended it to be a sort of light tankette. Now, unfortunately, what they've done is they've sent me the hull of a Har-Go, which I think is type 95. Yeah, but they've sent me the tracks for a type 94, and they're not the same size. As you can see, you end up with a massive kind of excess of hull at either side, and they're not right. I've looked and looked on the website, and it's quite obvious that the tankette and the Har-Go are different tanks with different tracks, but absolutely no way I can correct that now. I don't think Warlord would be interested in supplying me with just the individual tracks, so I think that's a write-off really as far as purchase goes. I mean, I might be able to kind of cut it down and have it as a model kind of embedded in the ground, as it were, you know, so reinforced. I don't know, but it was a bit kind of miffed at myself really for not spotting that when I purchased it, but I left it too late now to get any kind of remedy to it. Right, next up then are these figures that I got out of my lead mounting. Start with the one at the back, which is the free figure that you get if you order Armies of Japan directly from Warlord. I'm not terribly keen on this figure for a number of reasons. With most of the other supplements, the character has a sort of certain individuality of one type or another. They're either in a very kind of dramatic pose, or they represent a particular personality from the army. This is just, as far as I can tell, a regular Japanese infantryman. nothing special about him. I mean, he's not badly sculpted or anything like that, but you know, his sole use is that he's another figure that I can add into my my army. But he's not. This is the thing. He's not really compatible in appearance either with the assault group figures that I already have painted up, or with these ones at the back that are from Warlord as well. And this is a bit of a problem I find with Warlord. Their figures, they're kind of a congregation of so many different ranges and sculptors that they have acquired the sole rights to, rather than having a kind of what's the word? A sort of an in-house uniformity to their ranges. They're a bit of a ragbag. Some of their ranges are excellent. Some of their figures are excellent. Some of them are decidedly not. And it's very hard to kind of... You have to kind of look at each individual blister pack and each individual figure and make your own mind up about whether you think it's worth buying or not. You can't just dive in and buy a whole list of figures and hope that they're all going to be they're all going to match and they're all going to fit in with your current army. Another problem I got with this figure is the huge amount of luggage and accessories and things, backpacks and so on, that he's carrying, and that is even more so the case with these other 10 figures, and this is where I'm going to have to kind of cut backwards and forwards now between this tabletop and this group of figures here and the table surface with the books on them, because I want to sort of illustrate what I mean. But look how busy the figures are. I mean, as a group, they are sold as 10 figures and described as veteran infantrymen. If you were to buy them individually, you'll find on Warlord's website that they're described as jungle fighters and not as veteran infantry. Now, I mean, it's a minor point, but jungle fighters aren't necessarily veterans, and veterans don't necessarily wear leafy kind of camouflage everywhere they fight. They really, to my mind, you don't need to purchase veteran, in inverted commas, figures. If you're going to describe your infantryman or your group of infantrymen on the tabletop as veteran, that's fine, and it's understood with your opponent. It's very hard to portray them in a sculpt, and I mean, an obvious way would be to give them kind of hardened faces, to put a lot of work into their facial expressions, and maybe I don't know, maybe that's why they have been portrayed with all this sort of busyness on their backs. I mean, it's much easier if you take... I mean, there's not a lot of difference, really, between an elite and a veteran group, I would suggest. So something like my paras, you know, they have to be termed a veteran. So you don't need to kind of find a way of expressing that in the sculpt. And I'm not quite sure why Warlord have decided to do this, to term these jungle fighters as veteran. For one thing, they don't really mix in with my current figures that I have. I'm glad that I've got them out of my lead mountain and painted up now, but they don't really look very similar to the assault group. Another kind of issue I have with them is that I really do not believe that any combat would take place voluntarily whilst wearing so much equipment. You would discard your pack unless you were taken by surprise, ambushed, or whatever. You would discard a lot of these encumbrances before you went into combat. It doesn't look believable to me. This is partly the theme of my ramble now, which is realism. I mean, I've already suggested that I don't find bolt action rules realistic, and that is not a problem at all, because I think there is an argument for removing realism from war games rules in order to balance the game, for instance, in order to kind of remove yourself from some of the more unsavoury aspects of warfare. You don't want the game to be too believable in order to enjoy it, and in order to have a chance of winning against your opponent with an army that was historically unlikely to win. But in terms of the accuracy of the figures, I think as wargamers we are a lot more concerned that the sculpts are appropriately depicted, that the weaponry looks correct, and so on. And all this equipment on these backs, I really struggled to determine what was actually being depicted. I mean, it seems to me as though there are entrenching tools there, in kind of covers and so on. There's obviously canteens, and the canteens I can tell are accurately depicted. There are sort of satchels and haversacks and so on. Some of the figures have this, what appears to be the Japanese flag, draped over their shoulder. I don't know. I've never seen that on a photograph or anything. If the Japanese were to wear the flag around their body, I mean, I think as I have seen in the past, it would be worn around the waist and concealed in a way so that it couldn't be captured or pillaged or plundered after you died, but not worn in such a kind of haphazard and kind of sort of clumsy way, really. So that doesn't look believable to me either. Some of them have this sort of very circular kind of feature on their back. I just cannot make out what that is at all. I've no idea. I'll show you some photographs in a minute of what I tried to refer to. But anyway, I should have said that in this group, if you buy them as a group, you get an NCO with a submachine gun. Most of them have the Arakasa rifle, but one of them has, where is he? There he is. This one here has a light machine gun. So one of these figures would have to be paired with him, rather than be what you see is what you get, because the light machine gunner has to have someone carrying spare ammunition and so on in the walls. But as I say, I sort of like the figures, I like the poses, I think they're nice sculpts, but they just don't look credible to me. So let's go back to the tabletop and talk about that for a minute. Right, now in terms of source material, I've mainly relied on these two books. As I say, I've already got a fair number of Japanese figures painted up, so I could remember the colours and the paints that I'd used for those, and I simply replicated that. On the subject of the colour of uniforms and so on though, in here, I mean, it is kind of remarkable when you go through this book how varied the colours of uniforms were. So really, I mean, it's partly dependent on theatre and sort of what campaign it was, but let's see if I can find an example of what I mean. You can get the same standard item of clothing, and it from being anything from a kind of pale kind of greyish beige through to a kind of very kind of tanned, almost sort of ochre look to it. There are kind of shades of green and so on, and brown in there as well. It reminds me rather in a way of the sort of the Confederate Army, and the mix of kind of colours that you would get in that when you're, you know, so that you can't really make a mistake if you apply a particular shade of grey or butternut or whatever to a Confederate figure, and I don't think you need to be too hung up with when you're painting your Japanese army what colours you use. But basically, if you keep within this kind of palette of colours, not the reds, and these are obviously specialist kind of uniforms, but if you keep within this sort of palette of drabs and olives and so on, you're going to be all right. So that's my point on that. But what I was particularly, this book is particularly good for showing the sort of standard bits of equipment. I mean, there must be a photograph of virtually everything that a Japanese infantryman carried with them in the various parts of the world that they campaigned. And I could not find in here anything that bore a resemblance to some of the items that are portrayed on the back of these figures. In particular, that circular bit of kit. I've no idea what that is, whether it's leather or metal or what it's supposed to be. The closest thing I could find, and I don't think I'll find it in a hurry, going through here again, was a canvas horse bucket. Which is obviously a very not sort of every soldier is going to carry one of those. There's some examples of entrenching tools there. So yeah, kind of happy with that. And the kind of various pouches and so on, they're all pretty easy to work out, but some of the things, there's too much clutter on these figures and too much that is difficult to define, difficult to work out what it is and what it's intended to be. And as I say, why go to the trouble of portraying all that on a figure when they're in combat? It's unnecessary. The figures are too busy. The other thing that I can use is this book here. This has got a lot of illustrations from Osprey publications in it, but it also happens to have a lot of photographs of this particular group of figures dotted around. I mean, they seem to have concentrated on it. So there's, for instance, there's the NCO. There's actually one page that's got, how many is that for? It's got 8 of the 10 figures at the top of the page there. So unfortunately, most of them are always portrayed looking, you know, facing the camera rather than showing what they have on their backs. But there are some, for instance, there where you can see that figure is this figure here and how they have painted it. I've given mine more of a kind of leather appearance, that circular thing, whatever it is. They seem to have given it more of a material kind of colouring. Is it meant to be a pan or cooking vessel, something like that? You know, like a wok or a frying pan or something. I mean, if so, they would have just been thrown away. You know, troops on campaign, especially in the jungle, wouldn't have carried that sort of thing around. They would have cooked in their canteens and what have you. It's a, you know, they wouldn't burden themselves with that amount of kit. Yeah, and I think that is kind of what I wanted to say on the figures, but I did want to say something else quite serious, really. And it sort of goes back to this whole thing about historical accuracy and so on. And there's a bit of a kind of generation gap, I think. There always has been with wargamers. I did overhear someone on one of their videos recently, I forget who it was, talking about how they were playing Bolt Action at their club, but there were another group of players who I got the impression were older and had been wargaming a bit longer, and they didn't go near Bolt Action. They stuck with their kind of larger games with their armies and so on, and had dismissed kind of Bolt Action for its simplicity. I mean, I know people who've done that, who do that, have that approach with Black Powder as well. They won't go near Black Powder. I don't have that kind of problem with them. I think, as I say, I think to me a good set of rules, first and foremost, is one that produces a playable game and an enjoyable game. But you can't get around the fact that these are historical war games, so you have to give at least a nod towards historical accuracy. Now, the way most people do that is they become very expert in knowing their weapons, knowing how, knowing their bits of kit and that kind of thing, knowing whether a figure is portrayed accurately or not, and so on, and studying the details of tanks and planes and their specifications, all that kind of thing. So yeah, that is being historically disciplined. But there's another side to this as well. Whenever I wargame the Second World War and paint figures and so on, at the back of my mind is always memories of my father. Now, I started wargaming as a boy, as I'm sure a lot of you did. Probably the majority of you are younger than I am. I'm at the sort of top end of the scale as far as I'm aware of YouTubers who are in this sort of niche of wargaming channels. Although my channel is I do want to sort of try and keep it as a sort of historical channel rather than as a wargaming channel as such. But as I say, when I do wargame the Second World War, I always think of my boyhood and the attitude my father had to my playing with model soldiers. And in those days, they tended to be the Airfix World War II models. He never ever joined in a game with me. Unlike nowadays, where I know a lot of you have got children and you encourage them to play war games and so on. My father kind of tolerated me playing with it, but he was clearly uncomfortable with the fact that I was portraying battles on the tabletop that he had actual experienced in real life. He had at the outbreak of the Second World War, he had actually already served 7 years in the army, and he fought right through the Second World War. He fought in North Africa. He fought the Italians. He fought the Germans. He even took part in a campaign in Syria and fought the Vichy French. And then his regiment was moved back to the Far East, and he took part in the Second Chindit campaign. Now, whereas he was prepared to talk to me a little bit and discuss my German Afrika Korps figures, for instance, and my Eighth Army figures, and describe how Vickers machine guns might be used, all that kind of thing, help me identify what figures were doing, and so on. When it came to my Airfix Japanese figures, he just did not want to know, and it was always kind of recognised thing that just wasn't spoken about. You know, his experiences in Burma. He did tell me some things, but it was never about the fighting. It was always about the weather, the conditions in the jungle. He had malaria. He was actually he returned from the campaign, the Second Chindit campaign, with malaria, and was in hospital for the latter part of the war. And it's only he took a lot of things to the grave with him, as did a lot of his contemporaries who took part in that campaign. But the Chindit campaign has always been a fascinating subject for me, partly because there was so much that I wanted to find out from him that I couldn't. So I have read about and studied it for a long time. For most of my life, I've always been picking up little snippets of information and so on. Now, he was part of a column that doesn't get a lot of mention in the history books. When you read about the Chindit operations, the second one, you primarily read about the bases at White City, Piccadilly, Broadway, those ones. And they were the predominant character after Wingate had died. He died very early on in that second campaign. The primary inspiration and inspirational leader was a chap called Mike Calvert. I would really like at some stage to do a video on the subject of the history of the Chindits, but I'm very kind of reluctant to do so, because I'm finding now that I'm getting quite dismayed with the triviality and the flippancy of a lot of the YouTube content. I'm not referring to any of the YouTube channels that I subscribe to or anything like that. I'm talking about this sort of background, inane kind of commentary that you get on any kind of YouTube video that you go to. And I just find I don't want to kind of open myself up really to that kind of remarks, and especially the more vindictive kind of commentary, the trolling and that kind of thing. So I just rather leave it unspoken, but at the same time I'm kind of almost compelled to do it, because what other kind of platform have I got to express my interests and sort of reveal my findings to the public. Anyway, one of the things that has only come out recently, in the last 10 years or so, are a lot of the things that happened in the particular area where my father was fighting. He was under a commanding officer called John Masters, who is a well-known personality in his own right, mainly for the books that he wrote after the war on the subject of Indian history and novels set in India and so on. But as a commander, he was a disaster. And the base that he was in command of was called Blackpool. And the Chindits at Blackpool were driven out of the base. They were defeated. There's no other word for it. And the defeat was all down to the mistakes and the bad judgments and the appalling command of John Masters. But one of the things that in particular that happened that my father never spoke about, but has been discussed in public now, in various documentaries on the television and so on, very kind of niche interest, was that when they were driven out of the base, they were driven. Their airfield had already been overrun. They couldn't escape by airlifts and so on. They had to slog their way out of the base across the jungle. In my father's case, he was picked up by a flying boat on a lake and flown out. But only the fit, or the reasonably fit, managed to get out. The weak, the people that were too ill with malaria, and the people that were wounded were left behind. And what actually happened in the base as they evacuated the base was that they doped up all the wounded who they couldn't take with them, who couldn't move. They doped them up with morphine, waited for them to become unconscious, and then shot them all. They shot their own comrades. Now, that's bad enough if you fought one campaign with someone. When you've already served 14 years, or it would have been 13 years by that point, in the army alongside people, to know that they are being, killed, compassionately murdered, in order for them not to fall into the hands of the Japanese. No wonder you don't talk about that. No wonder you suppress it. But here in this book, as I've had this picture open for quite a long time now, you can see this figure that I've painted up. It's the same figure there, pointing his rifle at a wounded Chindit and taking him prisoner. Is there anybody out there at all who really believes that the Japanese took prisoners in the jungle? If there is, let me kind of disillusion you. Why Warlord have chosen to take that picture and put it in, I mean, it can only be because they don't know the real history of the Chindit campaign. And, as the generations go by, and as all those kind of things were not written into the official war records and so on, you would only know if someone who had been there told you about it. And as I say, I heard of it first about 10 years ago when there was a documentary on telly, and one of the medics who was at Blackpool admitted to the killing of all their wounded before they left. It's not there. It's kind of in the periphery of history, and it's going to kind of disappear. And what is going to kind of take its place are images like this that youngsters sort of coming into the wargaming hobby will see and kind of not fully appreciate the horrors of the Chindit campaign. And this is why I say I sort of I have this very sort of split kind of feeling about wargaming, that I really enjoy wargaming. I really enjoy wargaming the Second World War, but I still have that, that kind of understanding of what actually went on and what it was really like, and know that my tabletop games are about as removed from reality as you can get. My father obviously didn't have that, wasn't able to make that distinction, and wouldn't have anything to do with wargaming with me when I was a boy. And I hope I've explained why. But all I'm saying is you have to kind of accept that bolt action games, war games in general, are not realistic, and don't take on the kind of mantle of a historian when you're talking about war games, simply from your ability to understand war games rules and your knowledge of the equipment, the rifles and so on. There's a human side to this that you will only kind of get through years of just from maturing and growing up and experiencing life, and reading behind the lines of a lot of the history books, and getting kind of first-hand accounts of war. Anyway, a bit of a heavy subject to end on. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to kind of expanding my bolt action armies now, and in particular, as I say, to wargaming the Korean War, which I'm already sort of set to go, but I'm going to certainly paint up a lot more armies in the next sort of 9 months. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. Bye for now.